Hello, language hackers. Benny here, welcoming you to the latest episode of the Language Hacking Podcast. In today's episode, Shannon and I talk to Lýdia Machová, a professional interpreter, founder of Language Mentoring, and a serial language learner. Some of the things we talk about in today's episode are what's involved in working as a language interpreter, how to become more than a passive language learner, finding ways to enjoy your language learning, why you should focus on one specific language skill at a time, why Ldia focuses on a single language for 2 years, and how to be okay with giving up a language. Have you been enjoying the podcast? Let us know by leaving us a review. We'd love for you to let us know what's working for you at languagehacking.com/review. We truly love hearing from you and we read every single one. And now, on to our interview with Ldia.
The links and resources mentioned in this episode can be found at languagehacking.com/36. Welcome to the Language Hacking Podcast from Fluent in 3 Months.
So hello everybody and welcome to another episode of the Language Hacking Podcast. Today I've got a friend of mine, Ldia, on, and Ldia has a very interesting story to tell us. So firstly, I met her at polyglot events, but she ended up running the polyglot gathering herself for several years. She's got a very successful language coaching business, and she's also given probably the most viewed TED Talk on language learning out there that just exploded in a very short amount of time. I was very grateful that she actually visited me right after she gave this talk. It was in New York. And she's a very interesting figure in the language learning sphere. So that's why we wanted to talk to her today. So thanks a lot for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Benny, for such a lovely introduction and for inviting me here.
So let's kick things off with your version of how you got into language learning and how you got into the language business. So can you give us a bit of your backstory?
Yeah, sure. So I started with my first foreign language when I was 11. That was English. And this is something very normal for everyone in Slovakia. And then my second language was German when I was 15. But just like you, Benny, I didn't quite enjoy it when I was at school. I wasn't very good at it. I think I was quite good, but I didn't really enjoy learning German. I loved English though. And because I wanted to become an interpreter and work with English, I realized I will need 2 languages to study at the university. So that's why I decided, okay, I really need to start working on this German because I really need the second language. And so I started to apply some of the methods that I now teach other people, how they can learn languages by themselves. That was mostly watching German TV and working with some text, with some grammar textbooks, anything that I could get my hands on. And I realized that I could turn myself from a person who did not enjoy German at all into a German freak. I really started to love German. I fell in love with it. And in 2 years, I was able to speak it fluently. So that's when I realized, wow, okay, this is interesting. I can actually learn languages by myself. So then I started applying this to other languages, to Spanish, Polish, French, Esperanto, Russian, Swahili. These are the languages that I learned later on. And those were the ones that I learned actually totally by myself without any teachers or courses.
So you said that you went from not really enjoying learning German at all to becoming in your words, German freak. So it sounds like you almost turned that on by doing certain things. So what was it that made that transition for you? Yeah,
so I think it was mostly the activity of doing something regularly by choosing what I do with the language. So in comparison, the usual language lessons that I had, the German lessons, were quite boring. We were reading texts that no one was really interested in. We had to talk about them with our classmates. No one was really interested in those topics, right? But then I started to watch German TV. And even though I couldn't really understand most of it when I started watching, I decided to give it half an hour every day. I made a special schedule, which I put on my wall, and I gave myself a motivating tick if I managed to get half an hour of the German TV every day. And I realized that after a few weeks, I started to understand more and more and more. And I remember the moment when I actually laughed at my first joke, that I understood in the German TV. I started watching TV series such as Friends or anything else that was there, that was going on. And I started to actually follow what was going on. And this was such an incredible experience for me. This was revolutionary because I remembered how it was not understanding German, not liking German at all. And suddenly here I was understanding bits and pieces of the German TV. And I understood more and more. The more I watched, obviously, the more I started to understand. So that motivated me to keep on learning. And I don't really know how that happened, but because I understood more of it, I was able to watch more of it and read more of German texts. And suddenly I realized this is actually quite an interesting language with a beautiful melody, with very interesting grammar. So my view of the language changed with the results, I would say.
So I definitely want to get back to your earlier experiences in the languages. But like you said, part of your story was becoming an interpreter. And this was actually something I was initially interested in myself for quite a while, and I never quite got into it. And it's hard enough to just speak a language and understand people and get into that ebb and flow. But to be able to interpret somebody else like that's an interesting skill. So how did you get interested in interpretation, and how do you recommend other people kind of consider this profession? If I wanted to interpret somebody, at least casually, what would I do to get started there?
I'm not quite sure if it's possible to do it casually if you want to do it professionally. Of course, you can always be an interpreter for your friends, or, if someone needs someone to help with a language, you can be the person to help them with it. But if you want to do it professionally, I think it takes dedication and to really start studying the language and practicing the skill of interpreting. As you said, it's something that is it's difficult, but it's not as difficult as most people think. I think it's a skill that most people can learn easily, but they need to apply themselves. They need to practice a lot, because what you need to do in interpreting is basically dividing your attention to two separate speeches. First of all, you listen to the speech of the speaker, which comes in through your ears. And second of all, you listen to yourself, because you need to follow your own sentences. Because as an interpreter, if you do simultaneous interpreting, that means you have the headphones on and the speaker speaks continuously and you interpret continuously. You need to, your speech is basically a few seconds behind the speaker. So you need to be able with one ear to follow what you are saying to make sense, to finish your sentences. And this is something that I learned is an easily learnable skill. Well, maybe not easily, but it's definitely learnable. I studied it at a university. I followed the professional path. And later on, I even taught interpreting when I was doing my PhD studies. And I realized with my students that even though they were not good at it at all in the first lessons, they were able to learn this skill within half a year or 1 year easily. And they did a pretty decent job. So I believe it's actually similar to language learning. It takes a lot of practice. It's not something that people can start doing if they're good enough at a language. So if you say, okay, I'm fluent at French now, I can start interpreting right away, it's probably not true. So you just need to spend extra time practicing, just like you need time practicing speaking if you want to be good at speaking, right? Or writing if you want to have a nice written expression. So I believe it's actually quite similar.
You had mentioned earlier that when you were studying languages earlier on in school, that it wasn't particularly your favorite subject and that you didn't feel that you were extraordinary at it, perhaps more of an average or a slightly above average student. But you decided to go into studying interpretation, which is a very languagey thing. So what made you make that transition from just kind of surviving through your language classes to pursuing a career in language?
Right. So I mentioned German and that I wasn't particularly interested in it, but I didn't talk that much about English because English was my favorite subject of all. I fell in love with it when I was 11 and yeah, I really, really loved it. And I was good at it from the beginning because I just loved the language so much. So that was why I decided to become an interpreter. It was because of English. And in Slovakia, it's not possible to study interpreting with just one language. You need another one. Because the Slovak language is such a small language, there's just 5 million people speaking it, that you could probably not survive on the market if you just interpreted with one language. So I needed a second one. And given that I had already spent 2 years learning German, I figured, okay, it will be easiest if I go with German. So at that point, German was kind of just, I need a second language, but the real passion was in studying English because I really loved that.
So after your experience with, of course, English and then German, you went on to become a true polyglot. You've gone through Spanish, Polish, French, Russian, Esperanto. You mentioned Swahili, and even from the past, you knew a little Slovak sign language. So how did that start? Like, how did you get into your polyglot journey after your experience for interpretation with English and German?
Right. So I had no such ambitions, to be honest. When I started to study English and German, I never thought I would be a polyglot. I really admired anyone who was a polyglot. I remember finding your website and I was so impressed. It was like, oh my God, this is so cool that someone is able to speak so many languages. That's so cool. I never thought I could do anything like that. But then I don't know how I decided to add Spanish, because I found the language interesting and pretty. I thought I could try learning it, and I tried it by myself with a book, but I didn't know how to do it, so I failed 2 or 3 times. And then I signed up for a course at a university. It was a free course, and I was super excited. Like, yes, this means I'm going to finally learn Spanish. Cool. And I went to the first lesson, and I realized there were 25 people in the room, and we had 1 lesson a week. And the teacher was the most demotivated teacher you could possibly imagine. So after the first lesson, I realized, okay, this is not my path to speaking Spanish one day. So I realized I need to start doing something. I don't know. I wanted to try something that worked for me with German, but I didn't really have any Spanish TV or anything. At that time, there was the internet, but it was not so full of resources as it is today. So I decided to read my favorite book from my childhood, Harry Potter, in Spanish. And this turned out to be a really good decision. I don't know how I figured it out. It was just like, let's try that. We'll see what happens. And I remember reading the Harry Potter book and listening to it at the same time. So I got the audiobook and the ebook. And I decided, just like with German, that I will give it every day. I will give it half an hour, 20 minutes or so. And I will just follow the text by both listening and reading. And this was actually a very good method because I really loved the book as a child. I read it at least 2 or 3 times, so I knew exactly what would happen. And this turned out to be a game of detecting or decoding the text like a detective, because I was following a text and suddenly I heard something like, Dursley's or Dumbledore or Harry, Hermione, and all these names that I knew. And I was trying to figure out what happened in that sentence, what happened in that paragraph. I had a few words, which, of course, in Spanish, if you already speak English, that helps a lot to understand a lot of Spanish words. So this turned out to be a really interesting game of, let's see if I find out what is going on in this part of the book. And again, just like with German, the more I read and listened, the more I understood. And I remember reading the rest of the book, the end of the book, almost fluently in Spanish. And it was magical. It was like, wow, I understand. But obviously that was just the passive knowledge, right? They didn't help me to speak the language. So I needed to apply other methods for that later on.
So moving on from that, what do you do to become a speaker what did you do with Spanish? And how did your method evolve for becoming a speaker of other languages?
Right. So with Spanish, I realized after some time that I really need to practice speaking. And I realized it at a party. It was a student party, and a friend of mine knew that I was learning Spanish. And she knew some Spanish guys that were studying with an Erasmus program in Bratislava. So she said, like, hey guys, come over here. Ldia is learning Spanish. You can speak Spanish to her. And they started speaking Spanish to me. But that's when I realized, oh my God, I cannot say almost anything. I understand what they're saying, but this feeling when you're stuck and you don't have the words because you've never practiced the active output, right? Which is very natural, which I understand now. So at that time, I realized, okay, I probably need to practice output somehow. So I found a Mexican student, Gabi, who was also studying in Bratislava, and I started a language tandem with her. We had a lesson in English and a lesson with Spanish, and we would meet at least once or twice a week regularly, and we would start really simply with the method of simplifying everything I possibly can so that I express something in Spanish. And step by step, my sentences were making more sense, and they sounded more intelligent the more I practiced. And I remember after half a year of learning Spanish this way, again there was a situation where I realized that I actually made a great improvement. because I was supposed to meet my friend Gabby somewhere downtown for a coffee with another friend. And she came a little bit later and she was very upset and she was crying. And I was like, oh my God, what happened? And she was so shocked because just a few minutes before our meeting, an accident had happened in the street and she was almost run over by a car. Nothing happened. Fortunately, nothing happened to her. She was safe, but she was just so excited from this experience, so shattered. And so she came a few minutes after this experience and she started talking to me in really fast Spanish. I mean, you can imagine if someone is so upset. And I reacted to her questions and I asked her, oh my God, are you okay? What happened? Tell me. We had a conversation for a few minutes. And after the conversation, my friend who was there with me looked at me and said, like, Ldia, did you just speak like that in Spanish? Like, I thought you had been learning for half a year? That's when I realized, like, oh my God, you're right. I actually did. And this was, I think, a very good test for me, because if you are in a situation where you are under stress, where someone is upset, they are not careful about the way they speak, they don't pronounce everything correctly. And yet I was able to have the conversation and understand her. So that for me was really, really eye-opening. That was like, wow, this has really worked. I can learn a language in half a year. And I think that was the most turning point for me. That's when I realized, okay, I'm going to try this with other languages too. But normally I spent 2 years learning one language and only then do I move to another one, because I realized that I need to have a really good basis so that I don't forget and lose the language later on.
Given that you've learned several languages now, do you have a specific method or maybe system that you found works for you across languages?
Yes and no. I wouldn't say that I have a method. I have a methodology, or an approach rather. I always try to come up with methods that I enjoy, that are fun for me, that enable me a lot of contact with the language, that are effective, because then I studied, other polyglot methods and what works and spaced repetition and all these things. And also what enables me to apply it systematically. And if these 4 pillars, which I call pillars of my methodology, if they are applied, then I think any method can actually work. I believe that you really need to make language learning fun, systematic, effective, and intensive in a way. It never happens overnight, and it doesn't happen if you do something 5 minutes a day, right? So if these things are at place, then you can apply any method. And that's what I did with my other languages. I tried many other methods. I tried the Goldlist method to learn vocabulary. I know you mentioned it on your podcast already. I tried Anki to learn vocabulary, flashcards, paper flashcards. I listened to podcasts, YouTube videos, TV series, all of these things, and I always combine them, because I also found that even if I like a method, it doesn't mean I like it forever or all the time. Even the Goldlist method, which is my favorite one, I use it for 2 or 3 months and then suddenly I'm fed up with it. It's like, okay, not anymore. I need to switch to Anki. I use Anki for a few months and then I switch back to something else. So I need novelty in language learning. I always need something new, some new input, because otherwise I get bored with it. So that's my method.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, we've touched on the Goldlist method previously, but why does this, and I know you'll switch away from it when you need that novelty, but why does the Goldlist method in particular resonate with you? Because people in the challenge have actually shared your video about the Goldlist method as an inspirational one to refer to. So, why does it resonate with you?
Right. Well, I think David mentioned it somewhere. I seem to be the biggest promoter of the method because I just share it publicly everywhere because I really loved it. The thing I love about this method is when you hear about it, you tell yourself this cannot possibly work. This is just nonsense. You're not trying to learn anything, and that's why you learn vocabulary. I mean, come on, it doesn't make any sense. But actually, when you try it out, what happens after 2 weeks is just pure magic to me, because you just wrote down a list of expressions. I don't go for individual words. I always go for expressions. And you read them out loud once, and then you do the same thing over and over again with other lists, but you never get back to the older lists, right? And 2 weeks after the first list, you get back to it. you test yourself. I actually test myself by actively asking what is this expression that I see in Slovak? What is it in German, Russian, or Swahili, whatever language I'm learning? And I give myself a tick or a point whenever I'm able to say that out loud correctly without any hesitation, without any mistake. And I find out almost always, 99% of the time, that 30% of those words are in my long-term memory and I remember them. And this is something I don't quite understand rationally. I mean, I've read a lot about the method, and I talked to David about it, the author, David James, but I don't know how it can work so magically. It's just, for me, it's always interesting to do the testing, because I confirm for myself that this really works. And that's what I enjoy. I mean, it's learning without any learning. It's just writing down lists of words you find interesting. I find it's a very interesting method because it's so different from traditional learning.
So for someone who's listening and might not know what the Goldlist Method can you briefly explain how it works?
Yeah. So I briefly touched on it. So you basically just write lists of words. You get a big notebook and you write, let's say, 20 expressions in your target language. You translate them into your mother tongue and you just write down this list, nothing else. The next day, you write another list of 20 words. The next day, another list of 20 words. And you never go back to the older lists, right? This is the interesting thing. So you don't check whether you remember the words from yesterday and a week ago. And you keep doing this every day for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, you get back to the first list. You test yourself, how many of these words do I know? And it seems counterintuitive, because how could you know if you never learned them, right? But actually, in the process of writing down the expressions, when you are in a state of ease and you enjoy it because it's just fun, it's not learning, it's just, it's for fun, that's when you actually do learn subconsciously. And as David explains, the method is just like breathing. We breathe in the best way when we don't actually concentrate on our breath. So the moment you start thinking about it, you start breathing maybe too shallowly or maybe too deeply. But if you don't think about it, your body knows how to breathe just fine. And this is exactly what is happening with the learning. When you just write down the list of the words which you want to remember, without trying to memorize them or learn them by heart, that's when your brain picks the ones which it wants to learn. And after 2 weeks, you just check which were the ones that my brain decided to learn. And what happens with the rest of the words is you rewrite them on another part of the notebook. And you keep rewriting every 2 weeks, the same list, until you're basically distilling this list. And you are leaving out the words which you have already learned. And this is important. So the 2 weeks are important because that makes sure that if you learn something and it stayed in your memory for 2 weeks, it is in your long-term memory. If you check on the next day, well, maybe you know it today, but you won't know it tomorrow, right? So it basically follows the SRS, the forgetting curve, because after about 2 weeks, the curve is more or less the same. It doesn't really go down that much.
Yeah, and I like what you're saying, that you're not married to this method. Like, it has worked for you, but it's not that this is central to your language learning process. So like you were saying, there's output becomes such an important thing. And I know that you coach a lot of people. So when it comes to people saying that they run into challenges, and what do you see as people's issues when they start to try to get in their initial conversations in a language? And what do you recommend they do to get around these?
Right. So I keep saying that the only way to learn how to speak a language is to speak it a lot. And this is what most people don't want to hear, or they think there is a different way. Maybe if I spend more time with Duolingo, I will be able to speak better, right? Well, no, because Duolingo doesn't really help you to speak. It doesn't help you with the output. So what you practice is what improves. It's a very logical thing, but I think many people don't realize it with language learning, even if they realize it with other activities in their life. So when I see that someone is struggling to speak a language, usually I think it has to do with other areas in the language as well. So usually it's not someone who has very rich vocabulary, understands everything easily, and just is not able to speak, right? usually they are struggling on other levels as well. So what I suggest doing is focus on 2 or 3 priorities at a given language learning period. For example, let's say 2 months. I think that's the ideal time to make language learning plans. And you say, okay, now I'm going to focus on my listening, vocabulary, and let's say reading, right? Or let's say we put speaking in there right away. So listening, vocabulary, and speaking. You focus on these 3 activities. You don't really do anything else, because I believe that the more you do something, the more it improves. And the more it improves, the more it motivates you because you see the results. I believe what is a problem with many people is when they, for example, follow traditional language courses, is they try to do a little bit of everything, right? So they read a text, they write a little bit, they do a bit of grammar, they do a bit of speaking, and then they don't really feel any progress because they have not put enough effort into a particular skill. So what I recommend doing is focus on that one skill which you want to improve. And at the end of those 2 months, look back and see if that one skill has improved, because chances are it will improve much better than if you do a bit of everything, right? And so the answer to your question is actually you need to speak a lot. So I subscribe to what you say. You need to get down there and practice, even if it's not as pleasant, or, well, it's uncomfortable for everyone at the beginning, right? But we need to get over it, because that's the only way to learn the language. And we just need to accept that mistakes are a natural part of this journey. They help us grow. It's something that we should not fear. And I understand why people do fear them, because, again, from the traditional school system, they were taught that if you don't know how to say this sentence, then rather say nothing, because if you make a mistake, I'm going to give you a bad grade or something. So I think people need to overcome this mindset, and then speaking becomes more natural. And once they feel confident in using whatever vocabulary they have, whatever grammar they have, they can improve and make it better, and make themselves seem more intelligent in the foreign language.
This speaking kind of fluctuates as you go through this process. So sometimes you feel confident in it. Sometimes you don't feel so confident in it. So on those days where it feels like someone might be slogging through a conversation, what would your advice be to them to help them through that difficult experience, like those bad days?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, I agree. This is a natural thing, and it happens. But I also think that people should understand, or try to understand, why it happens, because there may be a pattern. So, for example, what I realized, many people are much more comfortable speaking to another language learner in that foreign language rather than speaking to a native speaker or speaking to a teacher who is a professional teacher in that language, and on top of that is a native speaker. That's so stressful, right? I have a metaphor which actually helped me realize this. I've had a driving license for 12 years now, but I only really started driving this year. For 11 years, I was very uncomfortable driving, and I thought I wasn't a good driver. And I didn't know why. I mean, technically, I'm okay with like normal things, but just driving wasn't my thing. I felt very unsure of myself. I made a lot of mistakes. I preferred not to drive. And this year I started driving, and I made a little difference. This time I drove without my dad sitting next to me. My dad is a professional driver. He's a bus driver. He's really good at it. He can drive a car like no one else, but he also expects it of other people in his family, I suppose. And for 12 years, I always drove our car with him next to me. And I always felt like he's going to see every mistake that I make. And he also expected me to make those mistakes. So I was under stress. And that's why I actually wasn't a good driver. This year, I started driving by myself. And it took me a few drives to, get used to it. And now I feel so comfortable. I feel so good. I feel very natural at it. And I even don't make half of those mistakes that I used to make. To finish this, I really need to say my dad is a really lovely person. Okay. He's not like very strict or anything. He loves me, and he wanted me to learn the perfect skill of driving. Right. But I realized that when you are doing something like this, when you are under stress because you feel there is an authority who will see your every mistake, that makes the activity so difficult. And I believe this is the same when someone is speaking and their only experience is speaking, let's say, at a language lesson with the professional teacher to hear all your mistakes and other people who will also laugh at your mistakes if you say something, right? That's what we have in our minds. So what I realized is if people just say, okay, you are learning, let's say, German, I'm learning German, let's have a conversation. Then most people, when I suggest this, most people say like, okay, but who is going to correct your mistakes, right? This is the usual reaction. But I believe it's not as important to get all the mistakes corrected because anyway, you cannot really keep track of all the mistakes. You cannot remember everything. But it's much more important to be at ease and to practice a lot of output. And it's much easier to get someone to another language learner to have a conversation with. It's for free. It's fun. You can make friends. You can, talk about normal life and you both practice the output. So I believe that if someone is, if someone feels that they are very much under stress when they speak, maybe they should think about other ways of speaking. For example, talking to someone who is also a learner, or even applying self-talk, which is also a very interesting method where you basically speak to yourself. I think, Shannon, you have experience with this method. I think I heard you mention it somewhere. And it seems to be just as good as speaking to a native speaker, because what it takes is a lot of output, and that's what you practice.
Yeah, that was definitely my experience when I got into Spanish, and I got intimidated by speaking to native speakers, and I never made any progress my first months. But then I started speaking to the Erasmus students who were also learners like myself, also foreigners, and gave me a huge confidence boost because, like you said, you don't feel like there's an authority judging you. So I really, really love that. Okay, so one thing I wanted to touch on, just getting back to your skill in being able to do this with multiple languages and that you have your 2-year process. Something else you talk about are language islands. So what are language islands and how do you build them?
Right. So that's another metaphor of mine. I really like using metaphors to explain language learning, as you might have noticed. So what I see when someone is starting to learn a language, I see them as a person left stranded on an island. And I don't know if you guys saw the movie Castaway with Tom Hanks. It's this guy who's left stranded on an island and Wilson. Right, that one. I really love the movie. And when I saw it, I realized, oh my God, this is totally like language learning, because he was trying to get away from the island, but he couldn't because he built a little raft. But every time he tried to get away, there was always this big wave that would drag him back, right? And he hurt himself. The small waves were okay, but closer to the island. But the big waves out there, wow, that was a big deal. And that left him on the island for like 5 years, I think. And the only way how he could get away from the island was get across that last big wave. So what I see, why I see this as language learning, I guess that when you're starting to learn a language, you have a little raft, a little boat, and you are swimming away from the island. The beginnings are very easy, right? You are excited about language learning, so you get into it, and the first waves, no problem. You make progress every day. You feel it. It's amazing. But then you get into the mid waves range and the big waves. And I believe this is the B2 level, the comfortable fluency level. And if you don't get across that last wave, if you don't get a decent B2 level, the moment you stop learning, your raft will be dragged back towards the island. And this is why most people, or many people, I would say even most people in the world who have tried to learn a language have this experience. They say, but I've been learning English for 10 years. How come I always feel like a beginner? And this is because they start learning actively. That means they are rowing their boat actively. They get to the mid waves and then they stop rowing because the semester in their language school finished, or they take a little break, or, just life happens. And they really get back towards the island. Maybe not the very beginning, but they get back to their A2, A1 level, maybe B1. And you really seem to be forgetting the language really, really quickly if you don't get across that last wave. What I realize is if I do cross it, then I don't need to be in touch with the language even for several years. And then I just need to refresh it, maybe with an intensive weekend, or I need to go to the country, or you start watching series or something, get into it, and I can get back to my usual fluency level very quickly, within days. I don't lose the language anymore. So what I try to help people in the whole language mentoring business that I do is I try to help them get across the last wave and get the B2 level. Because I think it's a waste of time in a way if someone learns a language just a little bit. I mean, if they do it for fun, like many polyglots do, then that's fine. But many people think, oh, I will learn Italian just for 2 weeks because I want to go on holiday. And then next year, I want to be able to use this little Italian that I've learned. It doesn't work like that. You'll be a complete beginner by then because you haven't crossed the big wave.
I would imagine that this metaphor has a lot to do with why you pick 2 years to focus on each language. So I'd love to know more about this 2-year strategy and what motivates you to add a new language after those 2 years rather than spending more time than that period on a language.
Yes, definitely. The 2 years are important to get to a decent B2 level. I think it is possible in a shorter time, but then your language learning needs to be very intensive. So what I usually suggest and what I've done with all my languages is I usually spend no more than 1 hour a day learning a language. I've never done such intensive projects like you did, Benny. I just always made sure that my language learning was kind of part of my life, but it was never a big project, which I would put myself into. And that's what I'm trying to find a way for people to incorporate language learning into their everyday life without it happening a really big thing. So if you spend an hour a day learning the language, then in about a year and a half, you have spent about 500 hours of language learning, of language contact. And I believe this is more or less the amount of time or the amount of hours you need to get to the B2 level. Of course, it depends on many factors. It depends on how many other languages you speak, what language you're learning, what other languages you have already learned, etc. But for me, it was always roughly 1 year and a half of learning. And I always take some breaks, some weeks or months here and there. So it usually amounts to 2 years before I get to the really comfortable level where I know, okay, I can now stop focusing on this language and I will not lose it because that's what I want to do. I want to keep my languages long term. So that was the reason. But also it happened very naturally that after 2 years of learning, let's say Polish, I started to get interested in new languages. It was like, let's see what this French language is about. Let's see if I could apply the same methods to another language. So also naturally in my life, it kind of happened that every 2 years, more or less, it was never quite 2 years, I just got interested in a new language and started focusing on that.
And you've also incorporated some fun missions in some of your languages. Like for Russian, you booked a train trip. And like what plans do you have with Swahili and what other fun ways have you spiced up your language learning?
Yeah, so just like you, Benny, I really love combining language learning with traveling. I'm a big fan of traveling. So yeah, with Russian, this was actually one of my main motivators. I really wanted to do the Trans-Siberian Express. And I was preparing for it for actually almost 2 years. I really wanted to make sure that I can speak a very good Russian. I can be absolutely fluent. I can just be myself in Russian, not just get by. I mean, I could easily get by because Russian is quite close to Slovak. So even after a few months, it would probably be possible. But I always want to get across the last wave, right? So this was the main motivator for me with Russian. Swahili was also motivated by traveling. Although the main reason was that I wanted to test my language mentoring methods on a language where I would be a complete beginner. I really wanted to learn Brazilian Portuguese. I'm very attracted to this language through music. But I realized that after Spanish, French, and Esperanto, this will probably be a very easy process. And I wanted to test some of my methods on how to learn languages. So I said, okay, I really need a language where I'm a complete beginner. I don't have any help from other languages. So Swahili was probably a good choice for that. I was very motivated to travel to Tanzania. I even had some plans, but had to cancel them for health reasons. And unfortunately, that was the only time last year I was supposed to go there, travel there, and it got cancelled. And then I lost my motivation. I cannot learn a language just to learn a language. I really need something to get me going. And given that I don't really have any plan to travel there right now, I actually lost it. I didn't get across the last wave. So unfortunately, I'm back on the island with my Swahili.
I know for a lot of language learners that losing a language in that way or no longer studying a language can be a pretty big fear. So how do you overcome that fear and how do you not have any sort of internal pressure about letting a language go or about no longer studying a language?
Oh, I do. I always do. But it was a conscious decision for me with two languages, with Swahili and the Slovak Sign Language. So with the Slovak Sign Language, I attended a course for 2 years. That was a language that actually you cannot learn by yourself. In Slovakia, there are no materials. So I attended a course, and I was actually getting to the second wave. I think I was getting close to a B2, but I didn't find any friends in the deaf community. So after this language school closed, they just stopped doing the courses. And I didn't have any contact with it. So slowly I was forgetting it, and I had a lot of internal pressure. It was like, I have put 2 years into this language and I really want to keep learning it. It's fascinating. The whole community and the way it works is just amazing. But I didn't really have any ways to do it without going to great lengths. Because of it. So I decided after, I think 1 year or 2 years, like, okay, I'm just gonna leave it, because I was constantly thinking, what could I do to practice? I was going through some notes that I took about the individual signs, but it would be a lot of work to keep that language. So I just decided I'll let it go. But it was a painful decision. I was sorry about that. I would love to keep that language, but that's life. I didn't have the opportunities, or it wouldn't be easy for me to keep it. So I decided I'll let it go. And now I'm fine with it. It's just one of the languages I learned. It gave me a lot of insights into a completely new culture. So it's okay, but it's never easy, because all this work you put into the language, that gives you a special connection to the language, I guess. It's like with relationships, the more you care about someone, the bigger the relationship is. I don't know how to describe it elsewhere, otherwise, but it is painful.
Yeah, but it's just a part of the game of getting into multiple languages, because we can't possibly have 5,000 languages at B2 level. So if you're going to dabble in a bunch, some are just you're gonna have to accept that, and I've certainly had to accept that over the years with my own mini travel experience, so I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah, but I think we could mention here maybe that actually this is something that many people don't know about polyglots, but as we know, the polyglot community and many polyglots, this is natural for all polyglots. I think many people believe that if someone says that they have learned 10, 15, 20 languages, that they keep all of them, or that all of these languages are on a B2 or C1 level. It's not true, right? Most polyglots I know usually keep, let's say, 3 to 4 languages on a C level, or a really good fluent level where they're really comfortable to just say anything. And then let's say maybe up to 5 languages, I would say, on a B1, B2. And then the rest of the languages are like, I used to be a B2, but I haven't really kept the language. So I think we should state that, because I think many people's expectations are then different when they hear about polyglots, right?
Yeah, and that's definitely my situation.
Mine too.
I think that it's important, because you hear a polyglot and there's this either or mentality that they must have mastered, like whatever, you pick a number, 8 languages, 10 languages, 5 languages, they've mastered them, but that's not quite the situation. There's the spectrum, and you can only be somewhere on the spectrum, and there's only so much effort and time that you put to maintain those levels. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that some people, when they hear that I'm an interpreter and I speak, let's say, 9 or 7 languages, then they think I can actually interpret 7 languages, and I can interpret them in any combination. They will say, like, okay, let's interpret French into Swahili. It's like, no way, this would never be possible ever in my life. So, it's good. I think it's good that we mentioned that.
Definitely. So we've talked about a lot of different things today, and it's been very interesting to hear your take on a lot of things. And one question we like to pose everybody who comes on the podcast is what their understanding of language hacking is.
Right. So language hacking, I would say it's a way to learn a language faster, right? I would say this is the main definition. And for me, faster actually means not going to language courses for 10 or 15 years trying to get to a decent level, but rather to focus on the language more intensively, even if it's just 1 hour a day. I think that you don't really need much more than that, but to really tell yourself, okay, I'm going to work on this language and I'm going to get it across the last wave or across the B2 level, and I will not stop before I get there. I think if people make this decision and they really incorporate language learning into their everyday life, they make it a habit, they turn it into a part of their life where they don't have to decide every day, do I feel like learning French today, or do I feel like reading this book? No, you already have a plan, you have your system in place, and you just follow it, you make it automatic. That's when you can actually get to the comfortable fluency level within maybe 2 years, let's say, if people use the example that I've had. And and that's how you get to learn a new language in 2 years, which I think is much better than trying to learn or maybe having it at the back of your mind for 15 years, but not really applying yourself. Because then people really feel that they have been learning English for, let's say, 10 or 15 years. But I say, no, you have been thinking about learning English and you have been going to some lessons in those 10 or 15 years, but you haven't been learning for 15 years. So I would say, make it a real priority in your life. Tell yourself you will not stop before you get to the goal you want to get. For me, that's always a B2 level. And then apply yourself and find ways how to make it systematic and automatic in your life.
We've talked quite a bit about some of your past projects, but I'd love to know, what are your current projects or upcoming projects?
Right. So I do all my projects within language mentoring. That's my my own way of teaching people how to learn languages. And I help people learn languages, even languages that I don't speak. So this is the specialty, because I think the approach to learning languages is actually very general. You can apply to anything. So what we do is we have online courses where I explain all the methods that I've used to learn my languages, and people can apply it to any language they like at the speed they prefer. And we have two businesses. One is international language mentoring and one is in Slovakia. We actually do the same thing in Slovak for Slovaks, and we run many challenges, like monthly challenges. We try to help them focus on just one priority, not on everything at once. And like 1 month, 2 month challenges, but right now just in Slovakia, not worldwide.
Well, we'll definitely make sure people can check that out. That's, of course, languagementoring.com, but we'll have the link to that and link to all of your social media channels and other ways to get in touch with you. And, of course, to your TED Talk in the show notes for today's episode.
Thank you very much. But Danny, you forgot to mention one important thing. You mentioned that I visited you after the TED Talk, but you didn't mention that I actually talked about you in the TED Talk.
That's right. And I appreciated that shout out. I was giddy when I was like, I'm in this TED Talk.
I think your story is so inspiring. I really, really had to mention you in there, and people loved it, you know. So if listeners of this podcast haven't watched the TED Talk, I really recommend, and you'll hear about Benny in there.
Definitely check that out. Great talk.
Thank you.
All right. So all of that will be in the show notes, but otherwise, thank you so much, Ldia, for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Found it very interesting. And until the next time, I wish everybody happy language learning.
Happy language learning.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
At the end of every episode, Benny and I like to discuss something that we learned from our guest, a takeaway of some sort that you can apply to your own language learning. So what stood out to me personally most from what Ldia said was, you need to understand why you have your bad days in language learning, and you need to look for patterns in why these bad days happen. And I think for a lot of learners, we just say, oh, I had a bad day, and we don't think any more about it. Or we think, maybe I'm actually bad at this, or any of those other sorts of negative thoughts that get associated to those bad days. And I've never really thought about actually taking the time to evaluate what went wrong, what the common denominator is on those bad days. And so for me, that's definitely something that I am looking forward to applying to my language learning and those bad days when they happen. What about you, Benny?
For me, the interesting thing that stuck out was that she mentioned that she doesn't have a method to language learning, but a methodology. And that distinction is so important. And I know that I do get caught up with the method, that I have a particular app or a particular style that I have learned the language. And maybe I do stick to that a bit too much and a bit more variation while still maintaining the methodology. So like she said, she does at least something to improve her vocabulary, and that might be using the Goldlist method, but it may also be using Anki. And I think that's something I can incorporate. Maybe I personally tend to use Anki, but it doesn't mean I have to abandon it, but maybe I can mix things up and switch to using a different app and using a different methodology. So that's one thing. And I also really liked her analogy with the sitting next to her father as she was learning to drive. It's a great way to think of authority as being somebody, it feels like somebody is judging you. And that changes your entire experience with language learning. And it is a true reason of how I was able to get into Spanish in the first place, was losing that sense of an authority judging me. And I think that should really help other people who are listening to this to try to find ways that you can speak to somebody who is more on your level, and you'll get that comfort a lot faster than needing to wait until you're actually fluent.
Absolutely. So we hope you enjoyed this interview. We definitely found our discussion with Ldia interesting. As always, any of the links or resources mentioned in this episode can be found in the show notes for this particular recording. And we appreciate you listening. If you found this interview helpful, don't forget to leave us a review at languagehacking.com/review. Until next time, and happy language learning.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Language Hacking Podcast. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you found this episode valuable and want to help us out, please leave a review at languagehacking.com/review. The Language Hacking Podcast is presented by Benny Lewis and Shannon Kennedy and produced by David Sobel, with special thanks to the Fluent in 3 Months team. The theme music was written and performed by Shannon Kennedy. Find the show notes at languagehacking.com/podcast. Thanks for listening and happy language learning.